Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, excuse me, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently, we are in Acts chapter 21. This is a shift in the direction of the narrative in Acts. The last several studies we spent in chapter 20 when Paul gave his message to the elders at Ephesus. And uh, again, I think it should be required um, reading for all ministers, both personally, professionally, spiritually. But anyway, but the reason why Paul gave summons the elders is because he was on his way to Jerusalem. And he was really singularly focused on that. So he didn't want to stand, excuse me, he didn't want to spend the time, and I can kind of understand that if he had stopped in Ephesus, he probably would have stayed longer than he wanted. But as we're going to see, he's on his way to Jerusalem. Now, this is where, again, the storyline changes because everything changes for Paul, in this chapter. So let's get to it. Here we go. Oh, here we go. All right, Acts chapter, I don't know, I got 21. All right. Now, also note that this is, again, later in Paul's life and ministry. In chapter 20, remember he said to the elders that this would be the last time that he saw them. And we said at the time, history tells us that it wouldn't be the last time. So we'll track this as we go. And here we go. It says, now it came to pass that when we had departed from them, let me see if I got the right. Hold on, I'm going to change back to my translation here. I'm reading from, this is the New King James here, but you know me, I like here we go. All right. Verse 1, here we go. After we tore ourselves away from them and set sail. Now, notice what he says, right? We tore themselves. If you kind of go back and look at verse 36, after he said this, verse 36, after he said this, he knelt down and prayed with them all. There was a great deal of weeping by everyone. They embraced Paul and kissed him, grieving most of all over his statements that they would never see his face again. Now, then they escorted him to the ship. Now, notice the intense emotion there. One of the things we're going to see is that Paul, by this time, had really made a lot of friends. I'm going to say this, friends in the faith. And that's going to be kind of interesting later on down the road when we see that. I'm going to bring this out. That because of his ministry, and I'm going to say his ministry for good, okay, it profit the believers. So you can see how much they were embraced, how they embraced Paul. Now, admittedly, this is not hard to do with churches. I mean, usually pastors, by reason of the fact that they are pastors, are going to have that kind of foothold. But we're going to see how the genuine emotions. So they kind of clung to him. And then chapter 20, verse 1 says, and after we tore ourselves away from them. So you get this picture that they basically was like, we have to go and kind of prying their arms away, said, we have to go. Okay. After we tore ourselves away from them and set sail, we came by direct route to Kuz, the next day to Rhodes, and from there to Patra. Finding a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, we boarded and set sail. And after we sighted Cyprus, leaving it on the left, we sailed to Syria and arrived at Tyre, because the ship was to unload its cargo there. So we found some disciples and stayed with them 7 days. Through the Spirit, they told Paul not to go to Jerusalem. Now, this is a very interesting statement here, especially when we move forward. One, notice Luke was saying that they told him this through the Spirit. So it wasn't that they were just telling Paul their own opinion. Many people do that. Many people will give their opinion. Many people will say, here is my opinion of something. Here is my opinion. I think you shouldn't do such and such. And that's their opinion. You can take it or leave it. This has more force, because notice he said through the Spirit. Now later we're going to see how people, the Spirit of God used people and they would prophesy, okay? But we can assume here that this is already established. They are speaking to Paul through the Spirit. But notice this, they told Paul not to go to Jerusalem. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now, remember back in Acts 16, how Paul was directed by the Spirit to go certain places and not to go certain places. So interesting, we see here Paul is told not to go. Paul, singular focus is he wants to get to Jerusalem. So the question is he in disobedience? Is he doing the wrong thing? And watch this. So we can even explore, even though they're telling Paul, don't go to Jerusalem, it could be, don't go to Jerusalem now, but maybe go to Jerusalem at another time. Just like in Acts 16. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, hold on, let me go back there right quick. And let's see. Let's see. So notice here that this is in Acts 16, verse 6 says they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia and were prevented by the Spirit from speaking the message in, get this, Asia. So now we know he eventually went to Asia. Well, we know from the letter of Ephesians, but also even in Acts here, he went a couple of times. He had certain Acts 19. And so he went several times, but notice at this time, the Spirit prevented him from speaking in Asia. And that would have been Ephesus too. Ephesus, Colossians, different cities like that. So he said that he was forbidden from speaking. So, I'll go back to 20. So, what's kind of interesting is Paul not heeding. We're going to see this in just a moment until I get back there. So, they said, okay, through the Spirit, they told Paul not to go to Jerusalem. Verse 5. When our days there were over, because remember they were there for a week, we left and continued our journey, while all of them with their wives and children escorted us out of the city. After kneeling down on the beach to pray, we said goodbye one to another, then boarded the ship and then returned home. Notice how they would escort Paul. This is kind of interesting how they would escort Paul And it's interesting how they would quote Paul. Okay. All right. Where am I at? Verse 7. He says, when we completed our voyage from Tyre, we reached um, Ptolemais, where we greeted the brothers and stayed with them one day. Then the next day we left and came to Caesarea, where we entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. This man had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. Now, let's unpack this. Okay. First and foremost, again, remember, I don't know, some anywhere from 15 to 20 years after the events of Acts chapter 8. And notice he said we came to Philip the evangelist. And you saw such a mighty example of an evangelist as well as a work. He was the one who had preached the message to he preached a message to Philip. That's what it was, to Philip. And then Philip, remember, went down to, he was a eunuch of Ethiopia. So no doubt he returned to Ethiopia spreading the gospel. Okay. Now, notice he said he had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. So, the word prophesy here, this is not necessarily saying that they were prophets. Let's say like Isaiah, okay? That they would give the word of the Lord in a prophetic way, in a revelatory way. But the kind of simple definition of prophecy is to exhort, to edify, and comfort. So the words were that's the simple message, that when they would speak, that their words, and this is how you would judge a true prophecy. They would edify, comfort, and some other word, edify, comfort, and exhort. Okay. So it doesn't mean that they would say, now, thus saith the Lord, blah, 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 blah. Okay. But I'm going to say this. It also doesn't mean that they're not saying this. Okay. So it says the next day, so these 4 daughters who prophesied, okay. Verse 10, while we were staying there many days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Now, you may remember Agabus. He was, again, a prophet in Acts chapter 12. So here's the interesting thing here. Agabus was a prophet. So not only did he, when he spoke, his words edified, exhorted, and comforted, but he also spoke a thus saith the Lord. Now the question too comes up is, are there prophets today? Are there prophets today? Okay. And I have went over this, and it's worth going over again. One of the issues here is that when I say prophet, that I'm not referring to prophets as today's prophets, people today who put a title on themselves. So yeah, people today that say they're apostles and prophets. So I'm not saying. Let me just put it this way: those people who put those titles on, they're just that. They're titles. They in those kinds of ministries that do that are ministries to me that play a lot of games, ego games. And if you challenge them, if you say, okay, how is this in scripture? they couldn't give you a good answer. In fact, they would be offended. They would be offended if you challenged them. But yet, if they prophesy something and it doesn't come to pass, they're never held in accountability. A couple of years ago, there was a lady on YouTube and a huge following. She had a huge following, and she began to prophesy. She gave a prophecy, and the prophecy was that, and this prophecy was, I'm going to say around June, maybe started around May, where she said God told her she was going to be married by the end of that year. Like I said, it was a year ago, 2 years ago, something like that. This is what she said. She said, okay, the Lord told me this. And then for the next 6 months, well, I'm going to say 5 months, because I'll tell you how this story unfolded. She began to say, the Lord told me. And then she began to double down and say that, this prophet agreed with her and joined in on that. Yes, that's it. The Lord told me too. You're going to be married. And she was going to meet her husband at a certain time, and they were going to get married. And then she was going to be married by the end of the year. Well, so this was around May. Remember, in June, she was really talking up. I began to challenge, and people were like, "Oh my God, how dare you?" And then you begin to notice around October and December, she got a little quiet. And then when December came, you didn't hear from her at all. And then January came, it was like, oopsie daisy. I said, wait a minute, that makes you a false teacher. You doubled down on that. You said the Lord spoke to you. And then you also invoked some other prophet, so-called. You see, and this whole idea, God told me. Now, since it's 2026, last year, we had other series of prophets, people who said, the Lord told me September 23rd, Jesus was going to come. And they doubled down and they was like, oh, no, the Lord said for sure. And of course, September 23rd came and went, no rapture. It was a rapture prophecy. Then you had other people that came and said, oh, no, it's going to be in October. Then other people came and said, no, it's going to be in November. Then other people came and said, it's going to be Hanukkah. Okay, I'm trying to find that one because I wanted to respond to it and said, okay, December came and went, and I responded. I said, well, now, what will you say when your prophecy don't come to pass? Because see, God doesn't prophesy like that. God's prophets always, their words always come to pass. Their words always come to pass. Okay, their words always come to pass. So Agabus, now, so let me say this: are there true prophets today? I'm going to say that I believe, and as far as a prophet is one of the 5 ministry gifts that God sets into the church. The 5 ministry gifts that God sets into the church. And I have not seen any scripture that shows that out of the 5 ministry gifts that God has taken, okay, 2 of them out. It's usually the 2. They don't mind, they don't mind pastor, teacher, and evangelist. Those 3 gifts stay. But the apostle and prophets, they will say that there are no ministry gifts. That those 2, there are no apostles and prophets today. Just like they would say certain spiritual gifts, especially tongues, are not in offer today. But again, there's no scripture that says that what God has put into the church that he's taken out. None. There's nowhere where it says that. So to answer the question, do I believe that there are prophets today? I believe there are prophets today if they meet the criteria of a genuine biblical prophet. And I'll get into that next study before we move on. And don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP The Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are